Good evening. Welcome everyone, in person and online, to War on Gender, an expert panel on sex and gender. My name is Grace Wilkins, and I'm a 26 and the Vice President of Operations of the Dartmouth Political Union. On behalf of the DPU, I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation. The DPU is the preeminent nonpartisan, student-led organization dedicated to promoting open discourse on campus. To that end, the DPU hosts speakers from across the political spectrum, holds both student and expert debates, and organizes campus-wide discussions on relevant political issues. The DPU believes that advancing the robust exchange of ideas is the responsibility of institutions of higher education in a free and open democratic society. At Dartmouth, students have historically led this charge. In the late 18th century, literary societies were founded by students and functioned as nonpartisan forums for dialogue on public affairs. Today, we at the DPU root our mission in this history and continue this tradition of furthering dialogue on issues of societal importance. The topic of tonight's panel has prompted serious debate across higher education and our world more generally. 1.6 million Americans today identify as transgender or non-binary. The issue of whether to use biological sex or gender identity in our social policies, therefore, is an important one. To be clear, however, this panel is not about the right of any person to exist. Each one of us deserves to live free from harassment, targeted violence, and hate speech, and individuals who identify as transgender or non-binary should not be discriminated against. We acknowledge that this panel might not explore every nuance of this topic, but we encourage Dartmouth community members to continue engaging with each other after this panel. Advancing the robust exchange of ideas is the responsibility of all of us. I would now like to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, the President Emeritus of the DPU, Jessica Chiriboga. Jess is studying history and government at Dartmouth and will be pursuing a Master of Philosophy and History at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar in the fall. I would also like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Jack Turban, Professor Gina Rippon, and Professor Alex Byrne. Dr. Jack Turban is the director of the Gender Psychiatry Program and Assistant Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. His research focuses on the mental health of transgender and gender-diverse youth and has been cited in several court cases involving LGBTQ+ rights. Dr. Turban's first book, Free to Be, Understanding Kids and Gender Identity, is set to be released soon. Dr. Gina Rippon is an emeritus professor of cognitive neuroimaging at Aston University. Her research explores the use of neuroscience techniques to investigate social processes, especially those associated with sex and gender. She is an outspoken critic of the populist use of neuroscience research to misrepresent our understanding of sex and gender differences. Finally, Dr. Alex Byrne is a professor of philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Byrne's research explores the philosophical issues relating to sex and gender, and his most recent book, Trouble with Gender, Sex Facts, Gender Fictions, was released in January 2024. As always, any views expressed by our panelists are not endorsed by the Dartmouth Political Union. Tonight's panel will begin with opening remarks and moderated Q&A, followed by an audience question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, 2 DPU ambassadors will be holding microphones in the aisles for you. We ask that attendees refrain from making statements or speeches during audience Q&A so that we can maximize the number of questions asked. Thank you all once again, and now I'll turn it over to Jess to get us started.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'd like to give a round of applause for our panelists for joining us tonight. All right. So we're going to start off with opening remarks from our panelists. We're going to start first with Dr. Turban. So for this question, to give some information for the audience, I asked our panelists to answer the following question, which is, how do you define sex and gender? And given your definitions, what role should sex and gender play in our society? So I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
4 minutes. Go. So I'll start with sex. So sex is a multidimensional construct. It can be defined different ways. You could refer to sex chromosomes. So people think of XX as female, XY as male. You could also define it in terms of external genitalia. That's usually what we use for birth certificates. You could define it by internal sex organs, like whether or not you have a uterus. You could try to define it based on what gametes you make, so sperm or eggs. And for most people, those different factors are in alignment, but for a small number of people, they aren't. And so that is the field of medicine that studies intersex conditions or differences of sexual development. And just really important when you're talking about sex that you're clear which of those you're talking about. And so in academic research, there's been a move towards being more precise. And in medicine, it's particularly important because it sometimes has relevance for different health conditions. And then gender is one psychological understanding of themselves in terms of masculinity and femininity and how you relate to those concepts. I think of it as having three parts. The first part I think about is a transcendent sense of gender. This is like a hard to put into words, just feeling of masculinity or femininity. That's likely biologically based, inferring that from twin studies that show that transness has a strong biological basis as opposed to just being from environmental factors. I think that feeling you build on throughout your life with experience and language as you're exposed to different cultural norms and gender roles and how you relate to the nearly infinite moderated gender roles that exist. And then the last part that often becomes important in medicine is how you relate to your physical body. So both your primary sex characteristics that you're born with and secondary sex characteristics that develop from puberty. In terms of how I think sex and gender should inform political debates, I think it should really be based on concrete evidence and science. So in general, I think public policy should be evidence-based public policy. The 2-minute example I'll give is bathrooms. So we have research showing that trans-inclusive bathroom policies are associated with lower odds of sexual assault victimization against trans people. In other studies showing that they don't increase the rate of sexual assaults against the general public, that's mostly cisgender. So I really think it's information like that we should be relying on, looking policy by policy when making those decisions.
Wonderful. Thank you for your remarks. We'll move on.
Okay. You want me to go next?
Yes.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. I made some notes here. Thank you very much for asking me, by the way. I thought I'd pretend I was into auditioning for a band membership, so I'll tell you my influences so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a neuroscientist and I'm passionate about the brain, and that's really informed all of my research and teaching and writing throughout my career. In fact, possibly longer than that. There are kind of family myths that I used to trepan my teddy bears to see if they had brains, but set that to one side for the moment. I'm a feminist and everything that means with respect to issues of social justice, and a feminist scientist, which means that I'm really keen to ensure that my research should be used to support the issues raised in that area. And I'm also, as was mentioned, a so-called neurotrash warrior, and I'm very critical of ill-conceived and irresponsibly reported neuroscience research in the field of sex and gender. So actually kind of make myself unpopular with my colleagues as well. The question we were asked, how do you define sex and gender? Well, lots of different definitions that I looked at. I agree very much with Jack that sex is a set of contradictory, often overlapping phenomena, which are engaged in feedback cycles with other biological processes, but also social processes, and I think that's really important. And a kind of quick way of thinking of what I think of the definition of sex is that it's an internally produced influence with external consequences. What sex is not with respect to the brain, it's not an essentialist driver of the kind of hardwiring which historically has claimed to determine invariable and inevitable differences between women and men. And I refer to that as the inside-out model, and the reason shortly I'll get to. Gender, I think, again, is a set of social and cultural constructs which actually frame the context in which brains and their owners operate, and which can have biological consequences. And I think that's an important message, that I think that gender actually should also be considered as a biological variable, because it does change the brain in quite particular ways. So it's like, if you like, alternative definition to sex, it's an externally produced influence which has internal consequences. Gender is not the same as sex, although that term is often used interchangeably. to mean sex nowadays. We talk about gender gaps when they're not actually gender gaps. We talk about gender reveal parties. Don't get me started if I've only got 4 minutes. Gender reveal parties are not gender reveal parties, they're sex reveal parties, but that might set you thinking about something else. So with respect to the brain, it's not an independent, biologically disconnected process of socially constructed influences. And I'd really like to get away from that idea, which was actually to do with the sort of 1980s biological politics, second wave of feminism, that, you know, biology is completely irrelevant, and, you know, the reason that men and women are treated differently is to do with social constructs. I don't think that's something that we can still live with. And I actually take issue with only being asked to define sex and gender separately, as though they are separate and independent variables. So I think there's a third variable we should be talking about, and that's the term sex/gender or gender/sex, which is reflecting what I believe and what I think my work has shown is a kind of inextricable entanglement of the two concepts of sex and gender, however those are defined. And so that's, if you like, the outside-in model, that what goes on in the outside world affects us. And there's a couple of kind of bumper sticker takeaways from that. Just because something is in the brain, that does not mean that's how it got there. So we can talk about that in questions afterwards. And I think that brains reflect the lives they've lived, not just the sex of their owners. So hence the gendered world can make a gendered brain. And that's really why my book was called The Gendered Brain. In fact, I was going to call it 50 Shades of Grey Matter, but the publishers didn't think that was actually appropriate, so move on from that. What role should sex and gender play in our society? I was a bit taken aback by that question. I think what you mean is, putting words into your mouth, what role should our understanding of sex and gender play in our society? And I assume we're talking policy making, you know, how do we rear our children, treat our employees? How do we do our research? And I think that's what I'm focusing on, because I think that's really the area which brings together my interest in the brain, in feminism, and in the kind of critical idea of a neurotrash warrior. So I think we should use these definitions to make sure that we have an evidence-based understanding of what impact biological sex can have on our brains and what that might mean for all sorts of things, from physical and mental health through to how you rear your children. And also what impact a gender-based external culture can have on our brains. And I think, again, that's important because we need to understand that what goes on outside does change the brain, and how those are actually, those two influences are inextricably and dynamically entangled from the moment of birth and throughout our lives. So I think that's really something we need to think about. And in terms of what this might mean, I'd say, okay, as a research scientist, I think a renewed understanding of sex and gender should inform policy on the theoretical research landscape, how we ask questions about sex and gender and why we're asking these questions, because often that's forgotten. I think similarly, the empirical research landscape, what data are we collecting and how we analyse it, and also coming back to the kind of neurotrash warrior bit, this kind of science communication. I think that's really important, because what scientists say leaks out, if you like, into the public consciousness, and people that firmly believe in this is the case because neuroscience has shown, even if it hasn't actually shown that. So just to come back to a term which slightly, when we first started talking about this, the term war on gender was not something that we were exposed to. So I was slightly taken aback, and then I thought, okay, well, let's go for it. So I think we should use these terms to have a war on sexism and stereotypes. We should have a war on gender gaps. You know, don't let essentialist thinking sustain the idea that women and men, girls and boys are different, and this is somehow relevant. And I think also, just as a personal campaign, we should ban gender reveal parties. Just final word, what would winning this war look like? I would claim that winning the war would mean that your biological sex would actually be irrelevant, and the cultural landscape would no longer be framed by gender. Thank you. That's 4 minutes. But
You're set to go.
Okay. Well, thanks very much to the Dartmouth Political Union for arranging this event. It's billed as an expert panel, and already I feel a twinge of imposter syndrome. I'm a philosopher, and so I'm not an expert on anything. Anyway, it's an honor to be sharing a panel with a couple of genuine experts, Gina and Jack. Philosophers love disagreement, and I can already tell from Gina and Jack's opening remarks that there's going to be plenty of disagreement. So we were supposed to say what sex and gender are, and I thought we were also supposed to comment on whether sex is binary. Anyway, I'm going to do the first two things, and I'm going to ignore the much larger question of what role sex and gender play in society. It's a fascinating topic, but I've only got 4 minutes. So let me start with sex. So in the present context, sex doesn't mean getting laid, or as Gina and I say, shagging. Rather, it means male and female, the two reproductive categories. So we can easily classify many animals as male or female. My cat Lola is female. The adult deer without antlers are female. Bright red cardinals are male, and so on. But what is it to be male or female? What do Gina, Lola, and the doe have in common in virtue of being female? Well, it's a fair assumption that they all have XX chromosomes, but that's not the right answer. The XX, XY system is the mammalian sex determination system. It's the mechanism by which mammals become male and female in the first place. Other animals and plants do it differently, sometimes with different chromosomes, sometimes with no chromosomes at all. For example, female crocodiles have no sex chromosomes. Their sex is determined by egg incubation temperature. For the same reason, we shouldn't confuse sex with genitalia or hormones or brain structures or anything like that. So what is it to be female? Well, the answer has been known for more than a century. The French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir mentions it in The Second Sex, published in 1949. Simply put, it's gamete size. That females produce large gametes, sex cells, i.e. eggs, and males produce small gametes, namely sperm. Now, sometimes people say sex is more complicated, and indeed Gina and Jack seem to be on the same page here. Also, Jack's colleague at UC San Francisco, the psychologist Diane Ehrensaft, who thinks that sex is composed of many components, including chromosomal sex, genital sex, and neurological sex, among others. But this is just a mistake caused by concentrating exclusively on humans. These are characteristics that are associated with sex in humans. They're not sex itself. Okay, so that's sex. Is it binary? I will interpret that question as asking about the number of sexes, specifically, are there exactly two? And as far as I know, the biologists haven't uncovered a third reproductive category beyond male and female, so the answer is yes, sex is binary. And then quickly turning to gender, this panel is called The War on Gender, but the war on what exactly? Well, who knows? We'll have to ask the organizers. And my point is, I think, illustrated by the account that Jack gave of gender and the account that Gina gave. They seem to be somewhat different. Gender is used in a bewildering variety of ways, for masculinity and femininity, sometimes for sex-type social roles, sometimes as an abbreviation for gender identity. And of course, as Gina mentioned, sometimes it's used as a synonym for sex, as in male and female. So we have gender roles instead of sex roles, the gender pay gap instead of the sex pay gap, two genders instead of two sexes, and so on. So I think that nothing but confusion comes from using gender to mean anything other than sex. So in my preferred usage, sex and gender are the same, and so I've already said what gender is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your opening remarks there. To give the audience more of a sense of what we'll be doing for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be asking questions to our panelists, and they'll have the opportunity to respond. Whoever would like to go first can go first. But I'd like to open up by, engaging in some dialogue on your opening remarks. So I think we could start. I'll leave the floor to you to ask questions to each other, and if you don't have a question, I'll follow in with my own follow-up question. So I'll give you space to ask any questions to each other.
I'd like to ask Jack about this concept of a sense of gender, which is biologically based, and what is the evidence you have for that statement?
Yeah, I would say, so do you mean the transcendent sense of gender?
No, I mean, you said we have a sense of gender, so
I think of it as there being three parts. So the first part being what I call like a transcendent sense of gender. That's the feeling that's hard to put into words.
Yes,
and then we build on that with experiences.
Okay. So
do you mean that part?
I did, yes.
Yeah, so so I can tell you kind of like the clinical experience of what we see, and most of my work is informed by working with trans patients. So often we'll have patients who will have a lot of trouble putting their gender into words. It's almost like watching people struggle to put emotions into words. But there will be something like they'll draw themselves as a certain gender and we'll feel like, oh wow, this is really me in a way that's not tied to like a specific thing I can word to the picture. Or there's this concept of gender euphoria where someone treats them as a different gender and that feels really amazing, or they see themselves looking more like that gender and it feels amazing, but in a way that's not just tied to like clearly the looks.
Okay.
And then there's this concept of gender dysphoria is used many different ways, but one way in which it's used is that when people are treated as if they were their sex assigned at birth, they have this really bad feeling. And so we know there are many people like that. And then the question is often asked, does transness come just from environmental factors? Or is there something like innate in biology that you're born with before you've had exposure to all of those social factors, language, gender roles, et cetera? So the thing that I think is most convincing are these twin studies where they take either monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins. It's going to get real boring, I'm sorry. So monozygotic twins have the same DNA. Dizygotic twins have different DNA. The idea is twins are generally raised in the same environment, right? So people will often look at these twin studies in different areas, usually of psychology, to figure out how much of something is from innate biology, presumably genetics, but it's more complicated than that, obviously, or environmental factors. And so when they do that, the twins of the monozygotic transgender twins are way more likely to also be transgender than the twins of the dizygotic twins. The twin pair of the transgender person and the dizygotic twin pair is almost never trans. So from that, it seems that there is some strong biological basis for transness, if you will, or the development of a trans identity that presumably is not from exposure to environmental factors based on that research. And so that's why I think of it as a separate part from the other complexity of how you relate to gender roles, et cetera.
I think the term presumably is what's worrying me slightly in terms of what evidence is there. I mean, I don't know what age.
Well, the evidence is the twin studies and
what age
trans
are these
people.
The twins you're talking about? Are we talking about?
Usually adults.
Adults, okay. So quite a long period of time where they've been exposed to different environmental influences.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we've had this discussion anyway, but it's just the idea that, if you think there's this sense of gender is biologically based,
but again, it's
the
comparison between the monozygotic and the dizygotic twins. So even if both of them are remotely out, the fact that there's a signal where it's way more common in the monozygotic twins than the dizygotic twins, I think is what is the convincing piece of evidence for me.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I think Jack has got something to say.
Could I just make a couple of points or just ask a couple of questions? So this sense of gender or this transcendent sense of gender that we all have, do we all have this?
I think people feel it to different degrees.
Okay.
It's likely a dimension.
But what does gender mean in this expression, the transcendent sense of gender? Transcendent sense of what?
So I should have said, so when I use gender, I use it as shorthand for gender identity. So it is like the hard to put into words, just feeling of your gender itself in terms of how you feel about your identity.
Sorry, but what does the word gender mean in my sense? So you explained gender identity as the sense of my own gender, something like that. An inner sense I have of my own gender, maybe, something like that.
I
mean, that's very close to the WPATH Standards of Care 8 definition of gender identity. That someone's gender identity is an innate internal sense of their own gender, something like that. Maybe the word innate isn't in there.
Yeah, that's not what I
No,
said.
sorry. Yeah. Anyway, but something like that is gender identity, according to you, right?
Something like what?
Your gender identity is your internal sense of your own gender.
Yes.
Okay, so what does the word gender mean in internal sense of your own gender?
It's your sense of identity in relationship to masculinity and femininity, which involves those three different categories.
I mean, what does the word
describing.
Sorry, I don't mean to be difficult. What does the word gender mean in the expression internal sense of your own gender?
That's the
internal sense of what?
Of your relationship to masculinity and femininity, which is those three different categories I was explaining. So it's kind of like the hard to put into words feeling of it, your relationship to gender roles and expectations, and then your relationship with your primary and secondary sex characteristics.
Okay, so I mean, just on the twin thing, I thought there was a study in some Nature journal maybe last year. It was a big Swedish study of twins, and my I mean, people can fact check this. My vague recollection is that they actually didn't find the sort of result that you were mentioning, where monozygotic twins are always sort of concordant for gender dysphoria.
So none of the studies have found 100% concordance.
Yeah, I don't think they found any concordance in the Swedish study. It was a big Swedish.
Pretty sure they found that it was more common among the monozygotic twins than the dizygotic twins.
Okay. My recollection is they actually didn't find that, but yeah, people didn't.
I think I'll follow up with a question of my own. So in Australia, there's a case called Tickle versus Giggle. It's quite an interesting name, before the High Court of Australia, and it involves a transgender woman, Roxanne Tickle, who was banned from using a female-only social media platform called Giggle for Girls. Aside from social media platforms, you could look to scholarships or affinity spaces or even dating apps as similar examples where this debate is being had. So I'd like to ask you all, are there certain instances where restrictions on participation restrictions on participation to cisgender women and men are justified, and others where they are not? Is there a way to make a distinction between those different spaces?
I mean, I think in the Tickle versus Giggle case, the issue is not whether you're allowed to have a dating app that's open to anyone who identifies as female. That's fine. But rather whether you're allowed, in addition, to have a dating app open only to lesbians. And I would have thought, well, what the hell? Why don't we give the lesbians their own dating app? If you want to have another dating app that's open to all those people, so including trans women who identify as female, that's fine. But I would have thought the lesbians should have a dating app of their own.
Any others want to?
I mean, yes, I think again, it's the kind of context. If we talk, I mean, are we talking dating apps? You know,
well, in Tickle versus Giggle is dating apps.
We are, you know, and I think that's quite important because sometimes there's a kind of one size fits all that, you know, if you're going to open a dating app to, or in fact the other way around, if you're going to close a dating app, then you should also close all sorts of other things which have completely different consequences socially. So I think that's very often when people pick on particular items and say, you know, that doesn't, you know, that's discriminatory, and therefore it's something that we should stand up against, as it were. But I think the context and what these things are for should be taken into account, which is a kind of fence-sitting argument, I know that.
Yeah, I think this is a complicated question. I think maybe you're like getting more where I land. I think I struggle with it because there's not like an evidence-based answer to this question, probably. It kind of sounds more like a legal question and the degree to which people are allowed to kind of freely associate and where to send their money and how they want to think about the world and interact with other people, invite other people into their private spaces that aren't government spaces. So I think probably those things are all protected legally, not being a lawyer. But I do agree with what Gina's saying that, you know, probably depends on the goal of it. Like for instance, if you want to have a scholarship that is meant to help people who have experienced like the stigma that one faces when they present as feminine in this world, then I could see a reason that you would want to maybe use gender identity for that scholarship. The other scholarships may have different perspectives.
We'll move on to our next question. So, Professor Rippon, you have argued that there are not significant biological differences between male and female brains. So I'd like to ask, what is the impact of biology versus socialization on sex and gender differences?
Well, I think one of the things that when I had to cut out when I realized I'd got only 4 minutes was quite a lot of the research that I've been involved in is looking at the consequences of the fact that we have a social brain, that we have a brain which responds to input, obviously input from the outside world, but social input, so that you can see quite dramatic changes if you present a problem in terms of, people like you are very good at this kind of task, and people like you are really bad at this kind of task, same task, but the individual's brains will respond differently. So the kind of historical picture of sex was it was kind of, you had a hardwired brain, and your brain was, and we were talking to Jack earlier, the opening lines of Simon Baron-Cohen's book, The Essential Difference, is the female brain, so there is such a thing, is hardwired for empathy. The male brain is hardwired for understanding systems. So that was, a really clear statement of what impact sex had, which kind of ignored any other in the context, what kind of training are these people exposed to, what kind of rearing, gender, parental rearing, etc. And I think that's the key issue that we need to take account of. And in the 1980s, with the second wave of feminism, there was a clear distinction. There was, up to that point, sex was the only term used for everything: sex roles, sex psych differences, sex roles, etc. And then gender came in as a saying that gender is a social construct, which is. And then we got into the kind of whole political campaigns deliberately designed to prevent women from taking up particular jobs, etc. And it was dissociated from biology. So there's a kind of biological politics movement, which paradoxically I got involved in. But I was never satisfied with the idea it was either this or that. And there seemed to be something that should be closing the loop. And I think what 21st century neuroscience is now showing, that now we know about how the brain works, about the plasticity, the impact of gendered experiences, etc., it can change the brain in quite significant ways. So what looks like something biological, because on average men do this and on average women do that, and people say, and parents say, I've reared my child gender neutral, and you think, yeah, good luck with that. But she's always, if I give her a toy truck, she puts it to bed, and if my boy is cutting his piece of toast into the shape of a gun, etc. So these are all kind of anecdotes.
Shape of a gun.
Yeah. There's anecdotes which are saying this proves, that sex is a powerful, unidirectional, hardwired driver. But I think what we're now showing about, for example, the consequences of bullying, of social rejection, kind of whole panoply of social experiences change the brain, structurally and functionally. And I think that's something which this argument 200 years has kind of ignored, because there was assumed that if something was in the brain, that's where it came from. There was some kind of internal innate factor. It wasn't a consequence that actually if your brain looks like this, it could be because of the life you've lived rather than what chromosomes you've got.
So there's a massive sex difference in childhood play. So, to a first approximation, boys like trucks and girls like dolls. Gina, is your view that sex difference is caused
Could you define massive?
I mean, as far as effect size goes, I think it's like, I don't know, Cohen's D1 or something. It's pretty big. But is your view that difference is caused largely by socialization, the sorts of social influences that young people are subject to?
If you pinned me to the wall and said you've got one sentence to answer or one word to answer, I say yes. I think what we've underestimated is, and this goes right back to babies and their capabilities at birth, because human babies are hugely dependent and, you know, can't speak and etc. There's always this assumption that they're almost subcortical. I mean, I think very early on the description of the infant brain was that, you know, it wasn't very well developed. But the infant brain is hugely wired to be social, because that's how they survive. You know, they need to know who the carers are out there and what the consequences are, etc. So I think when you're talking about differences in play, we're looking at differences which emerge when the child is about 2 or maybe 3 years old, which is a long time in cortical development terms, where they have been exposed to all sorts of, you know, as I say, we've got gender reveal parties where 20 weeks before these infants arrive on the planet, you know, they're being put into the boxes, which in your recent debate you carefully produced, so the pink box, a blue box. So if a society is kind of bombarding these children from the moment of birth, and their parents even before, with the fact that if you're like this, this is what you should like, this is what you should play with, this is what you should look like, then yes, I think that is a consequence of environmental influences.
Okay, so an alternative picture to Gina's is that a major driver of sex differences in play styles is prenatal hormone exposure, in particular the fact that males, unlike females, are subject to large doses of androgens, testosterone, when in the womb. And one piece of evidence that this is a significant driver of these differences in play styles is from studying girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. That's a condition where the adrenal glands produce more androgens than normal, and so these girls are somewhat masculinized in the womb. They're exposed to much more testosterone than normal control girls. And the play style of these girls is masculinized. So that's one piece of evidence that what's driving the difference is prenatal hormone exposure. Now, I'm sure you have something to say about that, Gina, but what is it?
I do too.
Do you just dismiss this
Well,
research?
do you want me to?
Yeah.
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, the CAH girls are very often held up as the evidence base for these kind of impact. Very often the CAH boys are kind of ignored. But I think the other thing about CAH is this is not a context-free condition. They have all sorts of medical problems. They have medicalized from early, or from the moment of birth, etc. And it's also the context where the parents, it is explained to the parents what the problem is, that these girls will have a lifelong medical treatment required, and the implications for their daughters of this condition. So I don't think that we're looking at a level playing field in terms of comparing cis girls, if you like, or girls without congenital hyperplasia with girls with CAH. And I think that's an issue that very often neuroscience itself forgets. You know, they assume that the people they're looking at in their scanners have all had a similar kind of experience. So when they put them in the scanner and they give them a task and the brain looks like this, they draw all sorts of conclusions about what this actually means without saying, how many, it's a bit better now, but it used to be, they were never asking females how many years of education they had, which some time ago were a lot less. So in terms of the kind of various abilities that they were demonstrated in terms of the tasks they were doing in the scanner, it was assumed that their brains was different because they were male and female, not because, in terms of a gendered experience, they had different experiences in life. And I think I know the CAH girls are used quite a lot, but I think it's not a context-free comparison.
I know Jack wanted to jump in. Can I just say
yes, of course.
Something? So I don't think CAH boys, so you can be XY and have CAH, but it's sort of you're basically asymptomatic because you're getting plenty of testosterone from your testes anyway. These are CAH boys are used in the studies. This year, a meta-analysis came out, I think from Melissa Hines was one of the authors, meta-analysis of at least 50 years of studies on girls with this condition. And as far as I can see, the evidence points only in one direction, and that is against Gina's view. I mean, I'd like to hear your alternative explanation of why the play style of these girls is masculinized.
Well, I think the evidence in terms of how it's measured, and this comes back to the methods, for example. I mean, I always come back to the idea that people use a tomboy index a test called the tomboy index to illustrate masculinization or feminization of children. And then you think, well, actually, is not the very existence of the term tomboy, assuming that there's some kind of, this is what a girl should look like, and a girl doesn't look like this, so we have to come up with the idea, oh, it's a tomboy, and then that becomes a test, which is then used. It's a bit like the people versus things test, which is another issue. So I think that the methodology is questionable. I think the effect sizes are not, I mean, they're not huge. You know, we're not looking at non-overlapping populations, which is the other thing that I think a lot of research and reporting of research tends to forget, that we're not talking about nicely distinct categories, boxes, internally consistent. So everybody in this box is like this, and everybody in that box is like that. There's quite an overlap, and that actually the meta-analysis you were talking about actually acknowledges that overlap and the variation in effect size. So, you know, it's a messy research area. It's not something where you can say this is definitely the case, and none of the girls, you know, ticked the I would like to get married and I do like climbing trees in the tomboy index, etc. So, you know, it's a messy area, and clearly it's a very important area, but I don't think it provides the full answer which it is sometimes claimed to provide.
Did you want to hop in?
Yeah, so I guess my answer to that would be they're socialized differently, so that could impact the results. But I think I would like for it to be this easy, that, you know, sex hormones in utero dictate all these things. And we often use intersex conditions to try and justify that, but I think every instance of it doesn't really make sense, right? So people use that example all the time, because people with, who are XX, who have CAH, they're a little bit more likely to be transgender. And so people say, oh, it's the androgens, they made them transgender, presumably. But they're also treated differently. So you can't actually say, like, the only thing that's different between them and someone without CAH with the same sex chromosomes is that prenatal androgen exposure, right? They have different socialization. And then complete androgen sensitivity syndrome is another one. So these are people who have XY chromosomes, like male chromosomes, but their bodies don't respond to testosterone, and the vast majority of them identify as women. So you might think, oh, there's something about like the androgen receptor, that you need that androgen activity to like develop your male gender identity. But they also all phenotypically appear female. So they're treated as female. And so I think, and also I will say, like, the intersex community hates that we even have these conversations, because they're constantly highlighting, like, they have very unique life experiences that are so different from trans people and cis people that are also awful, and they get so little attention. But yeah, I just in general don't think it's that useful to look at these intersex conditions to try and draw those conclusions because of them being socialized differently.
Can I just say one thing about that? I mean, I completely agree with Jack over complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Of course, there's some massive confound there, because to all outward appearances, you've just given birth to a normal baby girl, and, you know, the condition is only discovered later when the individual fails to menstruate. But in the case of CAH, it's quite different. And of course, researchers have tried to investigate whether the socialization of CAH girls is different from control girls. And indeed, some studies suggest that CAH girls are actually encouraged to be more feminine than their unaffected sisters. So I think this has been well studied, and as far as I can tell, there's very little evidence suggesting that differential socialization
Still a very
explain
different experience, though, right? Like you have a intersex condition, and people are trying to force you to act feminine is different than, you know, like you're an XX chromosome person without a condition who's living your life.
Well, the virilized, but yeah, yeah. I mean, the term intersex, but I mean,
yeah,
activists can use it as they wish, but I think it just totally muddies the waters. It's true that CAH is a classic intersex condition, but there is no sense in which XX individuals with CAH are some other sex or neither male nor female. They're just totally straightforwardly female.
Because you define it based on gametes.
Well, I don't define it. That's just what it is. I mean, it's not my personal definition.
Definitions.
Well,
that is how you define it.
Yeah, so
But you also,
I mean,
It's not.
I like to hop
It's
into
not my
it.
You don't like other people's definitions?
No,
but
it's
that is
not
your
my
definition.
personal. It's not my personal view that
Others share it, but it's
the
not
crocodiles are female.
Yeah.
Some crocodiles are
I'm
female.
going to hop in
That's
here
not my personal view.
on this discussion of intersex individuals. And so, you know, Professor Byrne, in your other public engagements, you've used, you know, comparison to balding. I think in a podcast you were on, you used that comparison. So I just want to tease out a bit more sort of.
You can't
this,
use what I said in a podcast against me.
no,
That's gonna be sound
I'm
against
using it
the rules.
to allow you
I
to
see.
describe sort of your different perspective, to sort of tease out the differences between perhaps, you know, Dr. Turban's use of intersex and sort of how you see it. So just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, I think that, I mean, I completely agree with Jack that people with so-called intersex conditions are often rightly pissed off that they're sort of dragged into this sort of debate where they, you know, where they definitely don't belong, and there's hardly any connection at all between having so-called, I much prefer DSDs, disorders or differences of sex development. There's hardly any connection between having one of those and being transgender, although, as Jack remarked, for some DSDs, for instance, CAH, they are associated with a higher odds of having gender dysphoria and subsequently transitioning. But the reason why intersex is such a misleading word is that it suggests that people with these conditions are somehow between sexes, like halfway between male or female. And although I think there are some cases that you could legitimately have a reasonable disagreement about, for the most part, it's quite easy to classify people with DSDs as just straightforwardly male or female. I mean, you know, you have to realize that someone who is just straightforwardly male needn't be stereotypically male and have all the male equipment. You know, if you
Because you define it based on their gametes.
Well, again, this is not my personal definition. I'm just going by what the biologists have been saying for more than a century.
So as I understand it, based on what you just shared, you see sex as binary, as you described in your opening remarks, and you too would describe sex
Well,
not
we probably
as binary.
have fairly common ground on their two gametes. Not everybody makes gametes.
No, of course not. No, that's right.
So I guess in that sense,
Plenty of-
that questions the binariness a bit. But yeah, I would guess we all have common ground on that truth. But I just think there are many other, like you're not going to be able to get through the academic literature with only that definition of sex. You know, people use it very differently in different contexts.
Can I just ask? Yeah, it was a term you just used, which struck me. What do you mean by straightforwardly male?
I mean, it's not an unclear case of being male. Just a clear case of being male.
How do you know people's gametes?
Well,
you know?
What?
Like if you're saying it like all these things are straightforward and you're classifying these people
No.
based on that like the gamete definition of sex, but how do you know what people's gametes are? Like for doing research, I can't identify people's gametes to put them in categories for my research. I could, it would be weird.
But obviously we don't identify. Okay, so for a start, you can easily tell the males from the females, for the most part. I mean, you can easily, in the human case, you can do it. You can easily tell the male peacock apart from the female peahen.
Now you're not defining based on gametes.
No, I'm not. No, I'm just saying that. So one issue is what is sex?
Sorry to interrupt your question.
One issue is what is sex? What are male and female? What is it to be male and female? Quite another issue is how you identify someone as male or female. Right? Those two things are quite different. You can identify people as male or female reliably by looking at their driver's license. That's no part of what it is to be male or female. These are totally separate questions. So Jack saying, yeah, but you don't examine someone's gametes to find out whether they're male or female, that is absolutely correct, but it's not an argument against the gamete definition of sex.
We'll go with a response from you, and then I'll move to my next question, or if you had a response.
Sorry, no, I mean, it just strikes me, it's the whole issue of why are you asking the question? And I think, in what context is this idea that somebody is male or somebody is female? I mean, if, for example, you're interested in, there appears to be a much higher incidence of Alzheimer's in females and Parkinson's disease in males, so then there are key questions to answer about, is it something to do with their biology? And I think in that context, it's fair enough. But if you're talking about toy preference or career choice, or why is there such a big underrepresentation of women in science, I think it's a completely different context within which to ask the question or to try and answer the question. And this is why I was taken by the idea that there was somebody's being straightforwardly male, as there was something out there which that you could hang on to, is saying, right, I now know, I can use that as an explanation for whatever it is I'm asking the question about.
It's like you found the sperm, I think is the
Sorry?
definition. to say they're straightforwardly, you just have to see the sperm.
Of course, there can be infertile males. Baby boys are male, despite the fact that sperm production is a little way off.
How do you know they're male? You don't know their gametes because they don't make them. Now you're
so but that's getting back to definitions, isn't it? Which
but this is important.
We'll move on to our next question. So 22 states across the country have banned certain medical treatments for trans and non-binary youth. Should doctors be able to prescribe puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and or surgical procedures for these children to transition?
It's complicated. Yeah, so I think yes, following existing medical guidelines. And the current guidelines are that for pre-pubertal children, no medical interventions are considered. The earliest medical intervention you would consider is a puberty blocker. So this is a medication that can either be an injection or a subcutaneous implant, kind of like those Nexplanon birth controls. And that will pause your endogenous puberty. If you were to stop the medication, your puberty will progress again. It's not without side effects. You fall behind on bone density while you're taking it, for instance. But it is reversible in the sense that your puberty will start again if you stop it. Traditionally, in the older endocrine society guidelines, the earliest you would consider gender-affirming hormones, like estrogen or testosterone, would be 16. What happened is that there were more, as people knew these medical interventions existed, there were more people getting into, it used to be right, like no trans person was gonna get to a clinic until they were 18 or 16 at the earliest. But now kids more and more are coming a little bit earlier. So they could start a puberty blocker at say 10 when they start their puberty, and then to wait from 10 all the way until 16 to start hormones is really compromising your bone health, potentially. So for that reason, the latest endocrine society guidelines say you can consider on a case-by-case basis, the idea being, I think, everything else seems relatively straightforward, starting as early as like 13 and a half or 14. Genital surgery, the vast majority of the time, is not considered until adulthood. The rare exception to that I've seen is a 17-year-old who's going off to college and they want to have their surgical recovery before starting. Gender-affirming top surgery is a big decision, obviously, as with all surgeries in minors, but under current guidelines can again be considered on a case-by-case basis. To complicate matters, those are mostly the endocrine society guidelines. The latest World Professional Association for Transgender Health Standards of Care came out last December and removed the age guidelines, which freaked the media out a ton. But in my kind of clinical experience, most people interpret that within that historical context of what the Endocrine Society guidelines have said and what clinical practice has been, that still is generally following those timelines.
Would either of you two like to respond to that question?
Not with respect to that. It's just the context of the question. And this, it sounds like a rhetorical question. It sounds odd to say. So what has the definition of sex and gender got to do with that question that you asked?
Yeah. So certainly the question earlier was, what does it mean to use the phrasing war on gender? And so I think as demonstrated in the opening remarks, there's different definitions that exist among our panelists on sex and gender. And so a big question that's come up, particularly for these medical treatments, is sort of based on your definition of sex and gender, does that dictate your particular position on children being able to access this? And I know that there's certainly some nuances people have in terms of whether parental consent should be required, whether they are comfortable with it for children versus adults. So that's sort of where the question is designed to get at, is based on your definitions, you may or may not have a particular perspective on the question.
But I think that's a question of medical ethics, which I think is different. I mean, it does sound silly to say, why are we talking about sex and gender in this context? But I think that's quite important. I mean, if there's a kind of a condition, I mean, are you saying the issue is that this is a physical condition which should be treated or shouldn't be treated? I don't know, maybe Jack would.
What's the question, sorry?
The question, it's about is this just a medical ethics question, or does it go right back to whether we think this is a physical sex or gender, or got some kind of physical basis which we can or can't or should or shouldn't manipulate?
I guess I could see the piece of medical ethics. I think it comes down to the way I think about kind of all pediatric medicine is we're weighing potential risks versus potential benefits. And I think, for outlawing the care, was that the question?
Or just in general,
banned? Should it be allowed?
Should they be allowed? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to say, doctors are banned from providing this procedure when there certainly are cases where if you're weighing the risks, benefits, and the unknowns, which again is not a small decision for a minor, adults have an informed consent model where the adult can learn the risks and benefits and decide for themselves. Minor care is a little bit different. You need to have a comprehensive biopsychosocial evaluation by a mental health professional to make sure that the adolescent really understands this treatment well, that the parents understand all the risks and benefits. It's like way more involved than anything else in pediatric medicine. And then you have to weigh between those stakeholders. Final decision maker essentially is the parents. That's true in all pediatric medicine except like STI testing, more or less. But it's the mental health professional, the endocrine prescriber, the parents, and the kid all talking together to make that decision. So I guess that's an ethics question, but that's how I think about it.
Okay, so in Britain, a large review of pediatric gender medicine just came out called the Cass Review. So 4 years ago, this eminent pediatrician, Hilary Cass, who was past president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, was asked by the government to undertake this review of pediatric gender medicine. So it took nearly 4 years. This was in the wake of various scandals involving the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS. The journalist Hannah Barnes wrote an excellent book about the various failings of GIDS called Time to Think. And Cass was chosen in part because she was perceived as this neutral, impartial figure. Anyway, so the report just came out like a couple of weeks ago, and it's 388 pages long. And as part of doing the review, Cass commissioned from the University of York, I think, 9 studies, 8 of which were systematic reviews. Systematic reviews stand at the very pinnacle of the evidence-based medicine pyramid. And there was one systematic review on puberty blockers and another systematic review on cross-sex hormones. And to no one's great surprise, both systematic reviews found that there is no good evidence that either puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones are beneficial. And so in the UK, that's essentially the end of gender-affirming care. You could still get puberty blockers in theory if it's part of a research trial, but I doubt very much whether there will be any research trial. So that now leaves the United States as very much a world outlier in the field of pediatric gender medicine, with lots of other European countries like Sweden and Finland and Denmark being extremely cautious when it comes to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So I'd very much like to hear Jack's opinion of the Cass review, and presumably, I'm pretty sure he doesn't agree with the recommendations that Cass made.
Did you read it?
Yes.
Did you read the systematic review?
I did.
How did it score most of the studies?
Okay, so
not the methodology. What was their result?
The systematic review of puberty blockers.
Mm-hmm.
So
low, medium, or high?
So they used something called the Newcastle Ottawa scale for scoring studies, and I think about half the studies were scored low, and the rest maybe there was one cross-sectional study in the puberty blockers case that was scored high, but most of them were.
Most of them were scored moderate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that's not low quality evidence, it's moderate quality. The scale that they used is a Newcastle Ottawa that they adapted. And so some of the things that you get downscored for on that, for instance, are if you asked the person self-report if they took hormones or blockers, or if it was gotten from a medical record, right? That was one of the adaptations that they made. I think people usually know if they've taken hormones, so I don't know that the scoring system was particularly the best. There are also, right, it's 388 pages and all of these systematic reviews. Most people have not read the whole thing, and certainly not seen all the results, right? I think if you had, you would have seen that most of them were not actually rated low quality, but as moderate.
No. I said I think about half of the studies they looked at were rated low, right?
But I think in your opening statement you said, it's all low quality evidence.
No. We aren't talking about.
And it's the end of the care because there's all low quality evidence, I believe, was your take home.
No, so on the one hand, you've got the systematic review, and the systematic review scores studies, high, medium, or low, or high, moderate, and low. And to say that a study is scored moderate doesn't mean that the study found that puberty blockers are beneficial at reducing gender dysphoria or something.
Well, yeah, but they did find improvements in mental health.
There are some improvements in various aspects of mental health, and some studies show no improvement. And the overall conclusion of this team from the University of York is that we simply have no good evidence to conclude that they make some positive difference.
We have a bunch of moderate evidence studies according to their very specific Newcastle Ottawa scale. And this level of evidence is not particularly unusual in medicine. I can't think of another example in medicine where you have that quality of evidence and you would ban the care. The report also doesn't say to ban care or to never get puberty blockers. In fact, it very specifically says there are circumstances in which people should get puberty blockers, and says to set up the studies to make sure there is ongoing access to care. But as you alluded to, they may not set up the studies, which I think would be dangerous and really in contrast to the report. So I don't disagree with the whole report. I do think the report was sloppy in many ways. The systematic review had some of those issues. They registered their methodology and then followed a different methodology than their pre-registration, which is very suspicious. And then rated a lot of the evidence as moderate, but then repeatedly said it was low quality. Those papers are peer-reviewed. Several people have written to the journal that they'll probably look into it and see if there will be corrections. I also think it's strange that the systematic review, said all of this evidence was moderate, but then the non-peer-reviewed final report, the Cass report that you're alluding to, doesn't use that language. They just keep saying, it's low quality, extraordinarily poor evidence base. So long story short, yes, it's 388 pages. There's a lot to go through. It does not say to ban care. And I think I would caution being very careful of conflating very technical terms from a grading scale for medical evidence with like a lay terminology saying, it's all low quality evidence and we should ban it. The reality in medicine is we have a patient in front of us, right? So if I have a young person who I'm worried about, I have to do something. And so if I have a patient who I think, I have to make a decision, puberty blocker or no puberty blocker, and it seems that the puberty blocker is most likely to help them, then I think it's a bad idea to take that option away from doctors and families. And in particular, like, what would you want me to do with a patient who has severe gender dysphoria? Like, what's your proposed treatment approach?
Quick response, and then I have a question for you.
I was just going to say, I think the context of the review is not that it working towards whether or not this procedure should be banned. It's whether or not there's good enough evidence that it should be applied. So I think those are two different questions.
Well, yeah, I think
because of the clearly understandable physical consequences of this treatment. It's not saying we should ban it. It's saying, is there enough evidence that even though there are these consequences, it is beneficial? I think that's slightly different.
I wish it were framed that way. that is not how it's been framed.
Did you want to respond, and then I'll have a question for you?
Yeah, so this isn't the only systematic review of puberty blockers. I think there have been like 5 other systematic reviews which have looked at puberty blockers, and they've all come to exactly the same conclusion, that the evidence base in this area is weak.
What do you mean by weak?
I mean, we just don't have...
Methodologically, what do you mean by weak? Like, what is it about the studies you do not like?
Sorry, are you? Sorry, I don't understand. I don't understand the question.
Well, you're making
I'm just making a claim about all the existing systematic reviews, as I understand them. They've all, for example, the NICE review in the UK, which was 2022 or something. All these systematic reviews have come to the same conclusion, namely that we have very little evidence that puberty blockers are either beneficial or detrimental, apart from the bone health, which everyone seems to agree is an issue. But can I? So,
but I think you're like using these rating scales to obscure what the data actually is, right? Because there are at least 15 studies. There are several longitudinal studies, so look before and after and find improvement in mental health after. That has the obvious limitation that you don't know if their mental health would have improved.
Right, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right, so we supplement that with cross-sectional studies, including, those are mostly the ones from my group, but there are similar studies from other groups, comparing those who accessed treatment to those who didn't, right? So kind of trying to deal with the fact that you don't have that control group. These studies have control groups that aren't longitudinal, so those supplement each other. And then people have done a lot of creative things, right? So they published in the New England Journal this Foresight R01 funded study where they looked for 2 years after gender-affirming hormones. It was longitudinal, so it didn't have that control group. So what they did was parallel process modeling with body congruence to find that body congruence tracked along with mental health improvement to try and do this causal inference. So sure, if you go in and you apply like the grade scoring as one of those very technical scales, that pretty much requires you to have randomized controlled trials to reach the highest level of evidence. The Newcastle Ottawa does not, but right, some of these other ones you're referencing, for instance. So you end up with a very technical phrase, like it is low quality to moderate quality on grade scoring. But that's very different from saying, there's no evidence, this is bad evidence, this is low quality evidence, the way it gets translated into the press.
I'm going to
Are you talking about Chen 2023?
Yes.
But, okay, that was a study that pre-registered 8 outcomes and only reported on 2. So
I'm not part of that study. My understanding is that they're spacing out their publications as they do data analysis.
Okay. I'm going to move to just...
They didn't. I don't think they used different outcomes than were in the pre-registration. They just haven't reported all of them yet.
I'm going to move to a final question just so we can get to audience Q&A. So, Professor Rippon, I'm interested, in your research on sort of there not being significant biological differences between male and female brains. I'm curious how your research may inform your view on gender dysphoria and sort of this the idea that of being born in the wrong body.
We're talking about the female brain in the male body type concept. Well, I mean, how it would inform that is the research shows that the idea of the male and female brain, which I've already kind of sarcastically commented on in the beginning of Simon Baron-Cohen's book, is that this idea, right from Gustave Le Bon, the end of the 19th century, it wasn't a question, did you have a male or a female brain? It was a statement. If you were a woman, you had a brain like this, and if you were a man, you had a brain like that. And of course, the other concept was if you were a woman and you had a brain like that, it was an inferior brain, etc. But moving aside from that, there was this belief that whatever it was that determined your anatomical differences, because they didn't have access, obviously, to understanding of genes, etc., also determined your brain, and that brain determined the particular skills you had, aptitudes, personality, whatever, which then determined what roles you had in society, because they were kind of working backwards. And so that was the kind of context of research at the beginning, and if the research didn't come up with that answer, then they got rid of the metric that they'd been using, because there must be something wrong with the metric if it didn't come up with the answer. And I think that's kind of an important message to remember, that very often people are working backwards from a kind of fixed belief that this is what is the case. And it was only once you started challenging the data, because even when brain imaging came in, because all of this was generated in a context of not being able to access the brain. I mean, you could, measure empty skulls and weigh brains and look at the consequences of disease, but you couldn't actually look at intact living brains in intact living humans. It wasn't until we started getting brain imaging at the end of 1990s, for example, that you could say, right, we can actually put people in the scanner and give them the kind of tasks which men are good at and women are good at. So right from the beginning, it was still this hunt the difference agenda. There was still this, let's find the difference between males and females. And I think it's taken a long time in the neurotrash years, etc., to say, at the moment, I mean, Lisa Elliott's work on, the paper Dump the Dimorphism, Daphne Joel's work on the mosaic brain, Cordelia Fine's work on, let's really have a look at this research, which is claiming these differences between males and females. All of this research is, coming back to the kind of argument, is kind of, is not proving the argument. And I think at that point you have to say, we can't say that male brains are different from female brains. I couldn't take somebody into my scanner and say, or look at a brain image and say, I know that's a brain image from a man, or that's a brain image from a woman, or I couldn't put a woman in the scanner and say, I know what your brain activity is going to look like. And I think that's really important to hang on to, because so much has been attached to that idea. I'm now kind of feeling I've kind of gone off the question that you've actually asked, and I apologise.
Can I just ask you? I mean, we should get on to questions.
Yes,
but,
yes.
So male brains are bigger than female brains.
Yes. Yeah.
And
males are bigger than females.
That's actually quite significant. And
Why
hold on.
No. I'm not going to. Yes, I mean, and certainly if you look at Lisa Elliott's paper, I mean, once you acknowledge the fact that on average males' brains are about 8% bigger than female brains, but male bodies are bigger, about 8% bigger than females, and so it's nothing to do. Sorry.
So what's the?
So the idea is that I think the male brains being bigger goes back to the kind of Gustave Le Bon type argument. So what?
Well, maybe that size is doing something. Maybe it isn't.
Yeah, but I mean, if people say that if something, classic in this area in particular, size matters, why does it matter? Why does it matter if male brains are bigger? What's that proving?
I mean, all I'm saying is that that's one difference between male brains and female brains. I mean, in humans. And is it not true that if you look at, say, the distribution of white matter and grey matter, you can reliably sex brains or sex their owners? Like
Not
more
if,
than
We'll do
more
a
than-
like
more
15-second
than
response, and then we're going to
90%
wrap
of the
up.
time.
So
Not
15-second
if you
response,
correct
and then we'll wrap
for
up.
brain volume, and that gets into another methodological issue. Once you've corrected for brain volume, and there is, I will perfectly acknowledge, a kind of whole debate about how you should correct, those differences disappear.
Perfect. All right, we're going to move to audience questions. We'll have our ambassadors and executives in the aisle, and you can feel free to come up and ask a question.
Okay. Hi. Thanks. This was great. Just two quick comments, and then I do have a question. So one is, Dr. Byrne, Professor Byrne, you were correct. There was this 22 study from Sweden. I just did a quick search for transgender twins that found zero concordance between same-sex monozygotic twins, and actually some 37% concordance with dizygotic twins of different sexes. So just one, two.
Who's the author?
Sorry, it starts with a K, Karamanis, something like that. I just searched transgender twin. Whoops, sorry, I'm locked out.
Sorry, can we move to the question? Our procedure for audience questions is just to limit the opening statements.
Well, I mean, he asked me, so.
Of course.
So my question, I guess, David Reimer just saying that's another potentially informative thing, but my question is, I'm curious what each of you think about how transgender people should be allowed to participate in athletics where at least one major goal is winning. It's not just like having fun.
Anyone like to
go
start?
first and do the study after. So I'm on the NCAA's Committee for Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects in Sports, but this is my personal views, not theirs. So the way I think about it is, for fairness, I think trans people should be allowed to have sports titles proportional to how many trans people there are in the population. And generally what we see is that there's not an overrepresentation of trans winners in sports, which could be for a lot of reasons, right? We talk all the time about these like physical differences from testosterone puberty. Those probably have different impacts on different sports. But what we don't talk about is, even if you look at baseline, so like transgender women are not cisgender men. So at baseline, even before hormone therapy, they don't have the same muscle mass and those other physiologic parameters that the average cisgender man would. And then also this deck is stacked against them in like every other way, right? Like harassment, discrimination, mental health difficulties, all these things that make it really hard to compete and succeed in sports. So if all those things were to go away one day and it does reveal that this testosterone-driven athletic advantage is resulting in an overrepresentation of trans people in titles, I think that's when we should look through and see if there need to be restrictions on participation. But I think as long as trans people are underrepresented in sports titles, it doesn't make sense to be targeting them for further restrictions.
I mean, the reason why we have sporting categories separated by sex in the first place is because an androgenizing puberty gives you a significant athletic advantage. So that's why males are bigger, faster, and stronger, or at least that's a large part of the reason. And so if we're talking about trans women who've gone through an androgenizing puberty, that should, I mean, unless we're going to tear up the basis of the, tear up the reason for having the sex category in the first place, that should put them on the other side of the line. There's no reason why you couldn't have a female-only sporting category and then an open category. Anyone can join in the open category.
But why aren't trans women dominating sports leagues? If it's unfair.
I didn't say anything about.
I mean, you're saying we separate it for a reason, presumably because it's unfair for people who go through testosterone puberty to ever compete against.
I guess. Look, when I was in high school, I persuaded my teacher to let me and my friends play bridge rather than go outside and play sports. So I have no personal interest in this, but it's good to encourage girls to play sports. It's good. It's good for the health. You've got to admit, it's at least for many girls, it's very demoralizing if someone like Leah Thomas comes along and starts winning in the pool or on the track. No one's talking about banning anyone from participating in sports. Simply that.
But Leah Thomas is one person. There's not an overrepresentation of winners, so it's always demoralizing when you lose. But right, you're trying to use Leah Thomas as if, any time a trans person enters sports, they're going to win. But that's not the case. They're underrepresented in sports titles.
We'll do a final response here, and then we'll move to the next question.
Well, of course, trans men are most welcome to compete in the male category. That's simply because even though they may have been masculinized by testosterone, they're not at any great advantage compared to males. So the issue isn't about banning trans people from competing in a category that matches their gender identity. Rather, the fundamental division is between those who've gone through an androgenizing puberty.
So we talk about demoralizing.
Right,
if you spend all day as a trans woman,
we're going to move
you're
to the
forced
next
to play
question.
in a men's
Can
category.
I-
We're gonna we'll do a 10-second response, and then we'll move to the next question.
My answer is linked to my kind of utopian view of a gender-irrelevant future. And I think we ought to turn this question on its head and actually not talk about male and female categories. I mean, maybe you could, in a way, find out, as in boxing, for example, you have welterweight and heavyweight and all of that. So you can have categories which are determined by physical characteristics. Supposing we could have categories of, and I know this is oversimplifying, but testosterone levels. So supposing you had 4 categories, T1, T2, T3, T4, and you say people who are T1 will compete in whatever sport they want to be, etc. Maybe in T1 there'll be more males and females and so on. So it's a consequence of this continued focus on thinking about male or female. And I think this is kind of illustrated in this issue of sports.
Perfect. So we'll go to this side.
Well, thank you guys for being here. My question is, some scholars, particularly those working in Indigenous studies and gender studies, have pointed to the presence of trans and non-binary people in non-Western cultures throughout human history. How does your understanding of sex and gender consider these varied cultural roles throughout history?
Anyone like to take that?
I'm happy to take. You can go ahead to take it. I mean, this is a great question. Let me just give one example. So in Samoa, in the Pacific, they have a third gender called Fa'afafine, which means in the manner of a woman. And these people are natal males who were very feminine in childhood. They have a cultural category all of their own. When their childhood feminine behavior is recognized, they're classed as Fa'afafine. They wear feminine dress. They don't think of themselves as women. They know perfectly well that they're male. They're sexually attracted to masculine men, and they have sex with straight men. So these people are essentially Samoa's feminine gay men. In some other culture, they would be regarded as feminine gay men. In the Samoan culture, they are philosopher. They have their own special status. And I think, I mean, one thing that shows, or one thing that suggests, is that you shouldn't confuse transgender people as we know and love them today, in particular trans men and trans women, with the genders found in societies like Samoa, because, of course, trans women think of themselves as women, or at least try to pass as women if they possibly can in society. They don't have some special category to call their own, whereas the Fa'afafine don't think of themselves as women. So that's one thing, and then the other thing is it illustrates how really quite flexible human beings are as far as gender roles go. So you can take a feminine boy who will turn out to be gay, and you can raise him as a regular old Western gay man, or alternatively, you can raise him in the manner of a woman as a Fa'afafine.
Any other?
Yeah, I mean, I again, great question, and just feel quite ashamed that being involved in this area, we don't talk to anthropologists more, because I think they would actually have a lot to offer to some of the kind of bickering that goes on, and then you know, look outside your own kind of weird, in terms of Western educated, industrialized, can't remember the rest of it, rich democratic countries. There's all sorts of other information out there which is hugely relevant to this argument. So, you know, I think we should actually be talking to anthropologists a lot more.
Oh, can I say one
Oh,
thing?
yes, sorry.
I agree, we should talk to anthropologists a lot more. And also, I'm not an expert on this, but I can say kind of the way I think about it broadly is like whatever that like innate, hard to put into words feeling of gender is, that seems to be there across cultures and over time, right? Like the Hijra people going back like at least 1,000 years, if not longer, documented cases. I think probably what happens, like we're saying, there's this complex interplay. So maybe you're born with that feeling, but what you're born into and those societal constructs, what the gender roles are, probably like shapes the way you think about yourself in a way that there's going to be different language that you ascribe to it and like a different conceptualization of your identity. I looked at the twin study. It is a different one than I was thinking. This one's complicated. It was because it wasn't that the twin pairs they found were different sex twins, so it is kind of complicated to interpret.
Hi, my question is kind of going back to definitions a little bit on gender identity and what that means. I wanted to talk about how there's like, Dr. Turban, you mentioned how like it's a relationship, someone's own relationship with masculinity and femininity. And I was wondering how the presence of like men who are very feminine or women who are very masculine, even like more masculine than a lot of men, kind of informs how we should make a distinction between someone feeling feminine, like as a man, and feeling like a woman.
Yeah, I think so both things exist, right? Like I know plenty of people who are cisgender and gender nonconforming who like don't relate to societal gender expectations. I also know trans people who aren't super gender nonconforming, right? So like there are trans women in my clinic who actually, like to the great annoyance of their mothers, like don't want to go get their nails done. They don't want to have their hair done. They don't want to go to the ballet. They have like traditionally masculine interests. But it seems that, right, that's why it's not all just your relationship to gender roles and expectations, because there are plenty of cisgender people who don't meet those, but there is this other like feeling, the hard to put into words thing that people have that is where I think the difference is.
Okay, we'll do one more question and then we'll unfortunately have to wrap up.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Rippon. In your earlier comments, you said that, in your opening comments, you said that you'd like to see if I heard you right, you'd like to see the day where biological sex is no longer relevant. And throughout your comments, you're talking about context being important. And the question I have for you is, in what context should biological sex not be relevant in the future?
Okay. There's a great book by somebody called Marge Piercy, a science fiction book written 1980s, I think. Woman on the Edge of Time. And the context is actually not about specifically about these issues, but there is it's a female with a psychiatric problem, and she either really visits other worlds. I won't go into it in detail, but there's one particular civilization where gender is completely irrelevant. People don't care whether somebody's male or female. They want to know what their interests are, what they can do, when somebody's asked, who they are or to describe themselves, being male or female never comes into it. And the person who visits this civilization is really taken with the fact that nobody cares whether you're male or female biologically. Interestingly, in the context of this civilization, the production of children, the bearing of children, has been outsourced to technology. So there are still babies, but they're born created via technological means. They are then reared by individuals who like rearing children. Some of them are male, some of them are female. So I think that issue of who bears the children is quite a key issue. So in terms of, if I think I heard your question right, at what point would biology be irrelevant? That could be one sort of point. But I think, again, it comes to why are we asking the question? If we do want to know why more women get Alzheimer's than men, then biology is relevant, and we should focus on that. But again, there's a context. Why do more men get Parkinson's than women? There is a kind of social context. Are they more likely to be exposed to industrial toxins because of their occupation in the past? Are they more likely to suffer from head injury because of sports and etc.? Bearing in mind there's a kind of historical issue with respect to that. So biology is relevant, but it also needs to be contextualized. Does that?
Well, during one of the other questions, you were saying that in the future, gender should not be relevant, but earlier you also said the effectiveness of biological sex is not relevant. And so I don't think that you answered the question.
Sorry, I missed the end of that?
I don't think you responded to the question that I
Okay.
We will, unless you want to
No. Yeah.
Okay.
So
do we have time for a...
We'll do the final response.
Okay, yeah, so Gina is an old-fashioned 1970s second-wave feminist. I mean, I totally
80s,
respect...
please.
Well, sorry. I mean, I totally respect that. She's a kind of gender blank slatist.
No.
Sex blank slatist. But I
don't think she said that.
I think
I'm not a blank slater.
Look, sex is certainly not going away. I mean, here's one massive psychological sex difference, namely sexual orientation. The vast majority of females are sexually attracted to males. The vast majority of males are sexually attracted to females. That is not going away anytime soon.
I mean, it is rapidly
going
away in terms of openly non-heterosexual people, actually.
Maybe. Or it may just be a passing phase, but we'll
it's
see.
a
But
trend.
in any event,
It's a trend. Yeah.
I think the sexless society, where sex is of no more importance than blondes versus brunettes or something, that is not on the horizon for what it's worth.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists for that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to everyone again for joining us this evening, especially our 3 speakers and all of the DPU executives and ambassadors for the work and time that went into this event. You can keep in touch with the DPU via our Instagram and website, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Great. Sorry if I was sassy. What? Sorry if I was sassy.